where you took an international perspective and said, what have other jurisdictions done, UK, United States and other areas, learn from those areas. If there was any area of our economy where I'd have a close look at, well, it would be energy markets, and I'd say, well, we want to learn from the mistakes that have happened there, and we want to make sure we don't repeat those mistakes, and we certainly don't want them in our education system. I think there is enough evidence, and I think in the end all of that evidence is being ignored by the government because, unfortunately, the government is taking an ideological approach, not an evidence-based approach. They have an ideological view about what our university and higher education system should look like, even what our schools should look like. And this is a government that, while it talks about red tape reduction and talks about freedom and talks about a whole range of things, in fact what it does is quite the opposite. It actually wants to dictate to the university sector and to students about how much they should pay, about where they should pay it, because there is also some evidence that's very clear when you research this particular area, is when there has been some deregulation in the past in the higher education sector, and there were caps, if you like, limits placed on maximum amounts that students could pay, but under the current system, under that system, you could lower fees. And the debate at the time from the then Education Minister, Brendan Nelson, was that fees would come down, and in fact that would be what would happen. But the evidence is 100% the opposite. No fees came down. No one got better value. In fact, it all went up. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, that's exactly what would happen, and this is why Labor will oppose this very bad policy.
I thank the honourable member for Oxley. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak on the Higher Education and Research Reform Amendment Bill 2014. This is an important bill which will expand opportunities for students, and in particular disadvantaged and rural and regional students, and ensure that Australia has a world-class tertiary education system. This bill has been significantly amended as compared to the bill which went through the House of Representatives but not the Senate last year, but nevertheless it preserves the essential elements of the higher education reform policy package which the Abbott government and Education Minister Pyne are pursuing. In the time available to me this afternoon, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to make three arguments. Firstly, that universities are critical to our national economic performance. Secondly, that today Australian universities are seriously constrained in the way that they operate. And thirdly, that the changes embodied in the bill before the House this afternoon will free up universities to be more competitive, more flexible and, in turn, to be higher performing. Let me turn firstly to the point that universities are critical to our national economic performance. You need only look at some of the indicators of the economic importance and significance of universities. There's evidence that improved investment in education delivers significant economic returns. The OECD has estimated a net present value of around $104,000 per man and $71,000 per woman who are university educated, attributed mainly to the higher lifetime taxes paid by a university graduate in excess of the direct costs of funding the additional university place. And I hasten to add that the difference between the two figures for a man and a woman reflects the time that women typically take out of the workforce in looking after children. Secondly, universities play a very important role as an employer. According to a policy note issued by the Group of 8 universities in 2012, there were over 112,000 full-time equivalent employees in the public higher education system, and that system generated around $25 billion of revenue. Another important argument as regards the economic importance of universities is the return on investment in research and development. The Universities Australia pre-budget submission in 2014 looked at a large number of studies conducted in a wide range of countries over a 30-year period to the mid-1990s. And these studies consistently found that the rate of return on investment in research and development is high. Equally important, of course, is the fact that innovation from research and development, in which universities play a key role, is a very important driver of per capita income growth, increasing productivity and living standards. Now, I think we can cast some further light on this subject of the importance of universities to economic performance by considering the experience of the United States, a country which is widely recognised as having the best research universities in the world. I want to refer to a very interesting book written by Jonathan Cole, the former provost of Columbia University, entitled The Great American University, Its Rise to Preeminence, Its Indispensable National Role, Why It Must Be Protected. In his book, Dr. Cole notes that as at 2009, 40 of the top 50 universities in the world were in the United States, according to a research-based assessment from the Shanghai Jiao Tong University. He notes that since the 1930s, around 60% of all Nobel Prizes have gone to Americans, and that a very high proportion of leading new industries in the United States, perhaps as many as 80%, are derived from discoveries at US universities. He cites the laser, FM radio, the Google search algorithm, GPS, DNA and fingerprinting, just to name a few. And he has this to say, quotes, "Universities have evolved into creative machines unlike any other that we have known in our history, cranking out information and discoveries in a society increasingly dependent on knowledge as the source for its growth." I think there are some important lessons for the Australian higher education system in the observations made in this book regarding the importance of higher education in contributing to national economic competitiveness. My views in this area, Mr Deputy Speaker, were strengthened when I had the good fortune to visit Silicon Valley at the start of last year, and amongst other things to attend a presentation given by Coursera, the well-known, although relatively new company established by two Stanford University computer science professors. It operates MOOCs, massive online open courses, and these allow millions of students to take courses online from well-known academics at Stanford and other prestigious universities around the world, including Melbourne University, the University of New South Wales and the University of Western Australia. These are exciting developments for the universities involved, but they also mean that every university needs to think very carefully about its competitiveness, including its competitiveness internationally. What is its position in the market, and how is it to sustain that position? I think the other important and interesting lesson to draw from the US experience is the importance of private funding as part of the overall funding mix in the US system. According to a 2013 document issued by the OECD, Indicators Education at a Glance, US expenditure on tertiary education as a percentage of gross domestic product is significantly higher than the OECD average, but a significant proportion of that expenditure comes from private sources as opposed to government funding. In Australia, our total expenditure on tertiary education as a percentage of GDP is much lower than in the US. If we can get more funding into our system from private sources, we can increase total funding into the university system. We can make our university system stronger, and we can make it a more important contributor than it already is to economic performance and innovation, something which is so critical to the modern knowledge economy. The other trend which clearly emerges from the OECD work is that there is a substantial level of private funding at the tertiary level across most OECD countries, and over time that is growing. And that, of course, is no surprise, because despite the wishful thinking we hear from speakers from the other side of the chamber, no government is in a position to fund without limit its tertiary education system when it faces so many other demands on the public purse. Governments around the world are facing many of the same issues as the Australian government in terms of how to achieve the continued growth of the education system, how to allow it to meet the needs of an ever-growing proportion of the population, and how that is to be funded. The previous government had no plan to deal with that. This bill embodies a plan to deal with that issue. This brings me to my second point, which is that, thanks to the incompetence of the previous government, universities in Australia today are seriously constrained in how they operate. Under the previous Labor government, we saw an uncapping of Commonwealth-supported places. That was a sensible thing to do as far as it went, and this government is maintaining the demand-driven system. But in the deregulation of student numbers, the previous Labor government did only half the job. They failed to deregulate the setting of fees. In other words, they deregulated quantity but not price. It was a half-hearted attempt at deregulation. The consequences of this are very significant. Universities today have little scope to differentiate, or, should they be in a position to do so, they have little scope to capture a premium for being able to offer a premium product. At the other end of the spectrum, the current system discourages universities from choosing to discount or to compete on price. As a corollary of the current arrangements, there is a very heavy reliance on international student fees as the principal area where universities are relatively free in their price setting. Then Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University, Ian Young, had this to say last year in remarks which I think sum up the position very well. We have universities that enrol large numbers of students, teach them as cheaply as possible, and then use the income to cover both education costs and meet the shortfall in research funding. And he went on to say, this is why our major research universities typically have student populations of more than 40,000 students. Compare that to Stanford with 15,000 students, Cambridge with 18,000, Tokyo with 28,000, and so on. As the G8 universities have pointed out in a recent research paper, much of the problem we face goes back to Gough Whitlam. Whitlam set an expectation that the costs of those who benefit personally from higher education should be paid substantially by those who do not. In doing that, he markedly changed the principle which had for a long time previously applied to higher education in Australia, namely that because students derive very substantial private benefit from having a degree due to their increased earning power, it is fair that they contribute towards the cost of the degree. We are left today with a system which continues to be in large measure a legacy of Whitlam, in which by far the largest source of funding for universities is government, and this creates significant constraints on universities at a time when they face ever more intense global competition, and we should be concerned that many top-ranking Australian universities are slipping in the international rankings year on year. Which brings me, Mr Deputy Speaker, to the third area that I want to address, the way that the government's changes embodied in this bill will free up universities to be more competitive and flexible, and hence to be higher performing. The deregulation embodied in this bill is a logical next step in an ongoing reform process. It will give the universities more autonomy and flexibility, and they'll be free to compete on price and on course offerings. To again quote Ian Young, quotes, "Deregulation will enable universities to differentiate, to play to their strengths," close quotes. The measures in this bill are consistent with the course of higher education policy development in Australia over the last 30 years. They arise from a path of incremental steps that have been taken over time to improve responsiveness to changing education policy. I do want to emphasise that despite the rhetoric that we've heard from some on the other side of the House, this package contains a number of very important equity and fairness measures. The bill, as amended, will introduce a dedicated scholarship fund for universities with high proportions of low socioeconomic status students that will be funded directly by the Commonwealth, and that will be on top of university-based scholarships. This will add to the already generous Commonwealth scholarship scheme proposed, with an additional package of scholarships funded by the Commonwealth. And this will mean that thousands of students from disadvantaged backgrounds in rural and regional communities will have even more help to get to university, particularly in their local area. The Commonwealth will, for the first time, be supporting all Australian undergraduate students in all registered higher education diplomas, advanced diplomas and associate degrees, as well as in bachelor degrees. The Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, Greg Craven, in an article in The Australian last year, addressed some of the overstated and overblown claims that have been made about the equity impacts of the measures that the government is pursuing. Speaking of Education Minister Christopher Pyne, he had this to say, quotes, "Pyne has retained and extended Labor's great initiative, open university entry for every qualified person under the demand-driven system. In real equity terms, it is much more important the kid from Panania gets their chance than the price of decorative arts law at Sydney University stays steady," close quotes. I might say, as myself a graduate in arts law from Sydney University, I thought that particular rhetorical flourish was a little cruel, but nevertheless. Let me go on to quote something else that Greg Craven had to say. Quotes, "In a scarcely remarked move, Pyne has moved decisively to protect students entering lowly paid but socially vital professions. Yes, public support for students will decrease overall, but the cut to nurses and teachers, for example, will be noticeably less, recognising their relatively limited earning opportunities, as well as the comparatively low cost of providing their degrees," close quotes. This is an important recognition from the Vice-Chancellor of a university which, as he notes in his article, educates quite a number of Australia's nurses and teachers. That is important recognition of the equity aspects of the package before the House, and highlights the point that some of the criticisms that have been made of the equity implications of this package are very much overblown. This bill contains some important additional safeguards, for example, by amending legislative guidelines so domestic fees are lower than international fees. The government has committed to maintaining the HELP loan scheme so that no student need pay a cent up front for their higher education until they graduate and are earning a decent income, over $50,000 a year, as a result of their education. Finally, much of the overblown commentary about the equity implications of this package tends to ignore the reality that the universities will be operating in a competitive market. They will face a market discipline. It will not be open to a university to set fees which are conspicuously above those charged by its competitors. They will be subject to the same market disciplines as anybody operating in a market. Mr Deputy Speaker, the package before the House this afternoon, including the elements that have been added as compared to the earlier version of the bill that passed this House last year, are very important, because what this does is continue a reform direction in education that has been underway for some time. This package recognises the importance of our universities being high performance. It recognises the importance of universities being free to chart their own course and gives them a much greater freedom to do that than they've had under the previous heavily regulated arrangements. That's important for universities, it's important for students, but most important, it is critical to our national economic performance, because universities are such a critical part of our economy.
I thank the Parliamentary Secretary. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I give the call to the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to participate in this debate on the Higher Education Research Reform Amendment Bill 2014, and I'll make some comments about contributions made by the member for Bradfield and the member for Hume,